The message reached Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in a routine intelligence summary, but its wording was anything but routine. Recommend Canadian forces be assigned primary assault role for fortified positions in Sector 7. American forces attempted reduction of similar German defenses in Sector 4 with limited success and high casualties. Canadian tactical methods appear better suited to this operational requirement. The report was signed by Colonel James Patterson, an American regimental commander whose unit had just spent 3 weeks trying to capture a series of fortified German positions in the Netherlands. An American officer recommending that Canadian forces be given missions American forces had failed to accomplish was not a common occurrence. It required a particular kind of professional honesty, the willingness to assess your own forces clearly, acknowledge what the results were showing, and prioritize the mission over national pride. Understanding how Patterson arrived at that recommendation requires understanding what he had watched and what it had cost. The Allied advance across France in August 1944 had generated real optimism. Following the breakout from Normandy, Allied forces had liberated Paris, driven German forces back hundreds of kilometers, and produced assessments that the war might end before the year was out. But as the advance approached the German border and encountered prepared defensive positions, the momentum that had made August feel almost like a conclusion collapsed into something far more grinding. The problem was not numbers. By September 1944, the Allies had overwhelming superiority in manpower, firepower, and air support. The problem was that German forces, though outnumbered and retreating, were defending from positions that had been prepared specifically to negate Allied advantages. Every canal, every river, every dike in the Netherlands became a defensive line. German engineers had flooded additional areas, destroyed bridges, and fortified every crossroads and strong point. The result was a defensive network that channeled Allied attacks into predictable corridors where anti-tank guns, machine guns, and artillery could be concentrated at maximum effect. American forces assigned to operations in the Netherlands encountered this network in September 1944 and struggled to move through it, using the tactical doctrine that had served them well in France. American offensive methods emphasized firepower and mobility, suppressing enemy positions with artillery and air support, then advancing with armor and mechanized infantry to exploit the suppression. Against German forces in the open and retreating, these methods worked brilliantly. Against German forces in fortified positions that could survive artillery, they worked considerably less well. Artillery could destroy buildings and create rubble. Rubble provided excellent defensive positions. Air support could not be used effectively against bunkers and fortified structures in Dutch villages without inflicting civilian casualties that Allied political leadership would not accept. The tactical toolkit that had driven the advance from Normandy to the German border was poorly matched to what the Netherlands required. Patterson's regiment had been assigned to capture a series of fortified villages along a canal line in early September. Intelligence assessed each village at approximately company strength, with extensive fortifications, anti-tank guns, and pre-registered artillery support. The American plan followed standard doctrine: artillery preparation, armor advance, infantry following to clear remaining resistance. The first attack failed badly. Artillery struck the target village for 2 hours, destroying most of the buildings and creating extensive rubble. American armor then advanced toward the village and discovered that German anti-tank guns positioned in the rubble were still operational and had perfect fields of fire across every approach. 3 tanks were destroyed in the first 15 minutes. The armor withdrew. Infantry attempted to advance without armor support, but German machine guns covering the approaches inflicted casualties that stopped the attack before it reached the village perimeter. More than 100 American casualties. No objectives secured. Patterson adjusted his approach for the second attempt. Shorter artillery preparation to prevent German forces from repositioning after the bombardment. Armor and infantry advancing simultaneously with infantry in close support to deal with the anti-tank threat. The attack penetrated into the village this time, but then became entangled in brutal house-to-house fighting, where German defenders used prepared positions and knowledge of the terrain to inflict casualties while withdrawing slowly from building to building. American forces eventually secured the village after 3 days. Patterson's regiment had suffered over 300 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, to capture a position defended by fewer than 150 German soldiers. The exchange ratio was unsustainable. He was left holding a position that was mostly rubble and had limited tactical value, with 2 more villages still to take. Patterson spent time after the battle conducting his own analysis, trying to understand why his regiment had struggled so badly against a numerically inferior enemy in a fixed position. His conclusions were uncomfortable but clear. American tactics relied too heavily on artillery and air support to suppress defenders before infantry advanced. When defenders were in fortified positions that could survive artillery, this assumption broke down and infantry advanced against unsuppressed fire. American armor and infantry coordination had not been optimized for urban terrain. American armor doctrine emphasized mobility and long-range engagement, but fighting in villages and towns required tanks to work within 20 or 30 meters of infantry, providing direct fire against specific positions at close range. And American infantry training had focused primarily on open terrain operations without adequate preparation for the specialized skills that urban combat required: room clearing, movement through buildings rather than streets, coordinating with armor at distances measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters. The methods that had worked brilliantly in France were poorly suited to what was in front of him. The critical shift in Patterson's thinking came at a coordination meeting with Canadian forces operating in the adjacent sector. The Canadians had been assigned similar missions, reducing fortified German positions in Dutch villages. Patterson wanted to compare notes on the tactical challenges they were both facing. What he learned changed his operational calculus. Canadian forces in the adjacent sector were attacking the same kind of fortified villages against the same kind of defenders. Their casualty rates were substantially lower than American rates. Their success rates were higher. They were accomplishing similar missions with fewer losses and in less time. Patterson asked the Canadian brigade commander, Brigadier William MacDonald, to explain what they were doing differently. MacDonald's answer was direct. We don't rely primarily on artillery to suppress defenders. Artillery is useful for disrupting German communications and supply lines, but it won't eliminate soldiers in fortified positions. We plan assaults, assuming defenders will be fully operational when our infantry arrives. He continued, our armor works at close range in urban terrain, sometimes within 20 or 30 meters of the buildings we're assaulting. The tanks provide direct fire support against specific defensive positions while infantry moves forward. It's dangerous for the tanks, but it's more effective than trying to suppress positions from distance. And our infantry training emphasizes urban combat specifically. Building clearance, moving through walls rather than streets, coordinating with armor at close range. By the time we assault a fortified village, our soldiers have practiced it many times. Patterson asked about Canadian casualties. MacDonald didn't minimize it. We lose people. Urban combat is brutal, and there's no approach that eliminates casualties. But we lose fewer people than we would using tactics that don't fit the terrain and the enemy we're facing. And we accomplish objectives faster, which reduces the overall exposure to German counterattacks and artillery. Patterson asked to observe a Canadian assault directly. MacDonald agreed. What Patterson watched was a master class in a form of warfare that his forces had not been trained to conduct. The Canadian assault began without the massive artillery preparation American doctrine would have prescribed. Instead, Canadian forces used targeted artillery to strike specific known German positions and to create smoke screens that obscured German observation. The preparation lasted less than 30 minutes. Then it stopped, and Canadian forces moved forward. Canadian armor advanced toward the village not in a broad front, but in narrow columns, following specific routes that Canadian reconnaissance had identified. The tanks moved slowly with infantry in immediate contact, each position checked as the force advanced. When the assault force reached the village, what Patterson observed bore little resemblance to how American forces conducted similar operations. Canadian tanks drove directly to buildings containing German positions and fired main gun rounds through walls at point-blank range. The effects were immediate and severe. Walls collapsing, buildings catching fire, rubble and debris filling the narrow streets. Canadian infantry followed immediately behind, not waiting for German positions to be completely suppressed, but advancing, while defenders were still disoriented from the tank fire. Infantry teams entered buildings through breaches the tanks had made, cleared rooms rapidly with grenades and automatic weapons, then moved to the next building without pausing. When German defenders attempted to reposition between buildings to counter the Canadian advance, they were caught in the open by Canadian fire. The speed of the assault was the decisive element. German forces had no opportunity to organize effective resistance before the Canadians were already inside the next building. The entire operation, as from initial assault to village secured, took approximately 4 hours. Canadian casualties were significant, roughly 40 killed and wounded. This was substantially lower than American losses in comparable operations. Of the approximately 120 German defenders, over 80 were killed and 40 captured. The exchange ratio heavily favored the attackers. Patterson watched from an observation post and found himself simultaneously impressed and unsettled. The Canadian methods worked. They also involved levels of violence and speed that exceeded what American doctrine prescribed. The point-blank tank fire into occupied buildings, the pace of the infantry advance into positions that were still being contested, all of this was outside how American forces were trained to operate. After the operation, he said as much to MacDonald. "Your tactics work, but they're more aggressive than what American doctrine allows. Our rules of engagement and our operational procedures wouldn't permit close-range tank fire of that kind? MacDonald nodded. I understand American forces operate under different constraints, but we found that in urban terrain against fortified positions, aggression and speed produce better results than firepower applied at distance. The close-range tank work is dangerous for our armor. It's also effective at suppressing specific positions in ways that artillery bombardment simply isn't. Patterson asked how long Canadian forces had been developing these methods. Since Italy, MacDonald said, we fought through fortified towns, Ortona, others. We learned through experience what works and what doesn't. The tactics we're using now are the product of 2 years of continuous urban combat. Your forces haven't had that same foundation to draw from. Patterson spent time after that conversation working through what it meant operationally. American forces were being asked to conduct operations in urban terrain against fortified positions, exactly the kind of mission their training hadn't prepared them for and their doctrine wasn't suited to. Canadian forces had spent 2 years developing the specific capabilities those missions required, paying for that expertise in casualties during fighting in Italy and Normandy. The expertise was now resident in Canadian units at every level, from Army headquarters down to section commanders, and it showed in the results. The recommendation Patterson sent to Allied headquarters was detailed and professionally honest. American forces can reduce fortified positions in urban terrain, but the casualties required are high, and the time required is substantial. Canadian forces operating in adjacent sectors have demonstrated superior capabilities for urban assault operations through specialized tactics and extensive prior experience. For operations requiring reduction of fortified German positions in Dutch villages and towns, recommend Canadian forces be assigned primary assault roles, while American forces provide supporting operations, flank security, and follow-on exploitation. This reached Allied command at exactly the moment when operational planning for the remainder of the Netherlands campaign was being finalized. Patterson's report, combined with similar observations from other American commanders who had worked alongside Canadian forces, influenced a significant practical shift in how operations were assigned, though the shift was never formalized in explicit policy. Coalition politics made it difficult to state openly that missions were being reassigned because one nation's forces had produced better results than another's. But in practice, operational orders increasingly assigned Canadian forces to fortified position reduction, while American forces concentrated on operations in more open terrain where their mobility and firepower advantages could be fully applied. The impact was visible in subsequent operations through the fall and winter of 1944. Canadian forces conducted the major urban assaults in the Scheldt Estuary campaign, clearing fortified positions that controlled access to the port of Antwerp. These operations were brutal and costly. The Scheldt fighting produced heavy Canadian casualties under conditions that were among the most difficult of the entire Northwest Europe campaign. But Canadian forces accomplished objectives that would likely have cost significantly more if forces with less specialized training had attempted them. American forces operating in terrain better suited to their tactical strengths contributed effectively to operations that required flexibility and rapid response rather than urban assault specialization. The December 1944 defense against the German Ardennes offensive showed American forces performing at a high level in exactly the mobile defensive operations that their training and doctrine had prepared them for. The combination proved more effective than attempting to use all forces for all mission types, regardless of capability matching. Patterson continued commanding his regiment through the remainder of the war. His willingness to honestly assess his force's performance and recommend that better-suited forces be assigned critical missions was recognized by his superiors as professional military judgment. Rather than an admission of failure, he was eventually promoted. In post-war reflection, he described his thinking plainly. Being a good commander sometimes means acknowledging that other forces have capabilities your own forces lack. The Canadians had spent years learning how to assault fortified urban positions. My regiment hadn't had that experience. Continuing to assign my forces missions they weren't optimally prepared for would have cost American lives without achieving better results than the Canadians could accomplish. The right decision was to recommend forces with the right capabilities be assigned the missions, regardless of national pride. The episode became part of the collective professional memory of Allied coalition operations in the Second World War, a case study in what effective coalition warfare actually requires. It requires honest assessment of what different forces can do and what they cannot. It requires willingness to adjust plans when operational results don't match planning assumptions. It requires prioritizing mission success over prestige. Every military force has strengths and limitations shaped by its training, its doctrine, and the specific operational experience it has accumulated. American forces in the Second World War were generally excellent at mobile operations, at leveraging firepower advantages, and at sustained offensive operations across varied terrain. Canadian forces had developed exceptional capabilities for urban assault through years of experience in exactly that type of combat. Capabilities that American forces with different training and a different operational history had not developed to the same degree. Recognizing this difference and adjusting operational assignments accordingly was not an admission that American forces were inferior. It was professional military planning that sought to maximize the effectiveness of the Allied coalition as a whole by putting each national force where its strengths could be applied most directly. For Canadian forces, the recognition was a validation that their expertise, bought through heavy casualties in Italy and Normandy, was real, was recognized, and was being used for the missions that mattered most. For American forces, it was a lesson in the operational importance of specialized training and in the reality that different terrain and different enemy configurations require different tactical approaches. That lesson shaped American military doctrine in the post-war years, particularly regarding urban warfare preparation and the development of specialized capabilities for specific mission types. The ultimate measure was the outcome. Canadian forces accomplished the urban assault missions assigned to them. American forces contributed decisively in operations suited to their capabilities. The combination achieved results that a less honest assessment of force capabilities would have made considerably more costly. Patterson's recommendation, "We already tried," said the Canadians, was the kind of professional honesty that coalition warfare depends on, and that military cultures built primarily on national pride find genuinely difficult to produce.